What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. We'll be going over 5 wide receivers to trade for in today's video, looking not only at volume, but also recent performances, and a little bit of playoff schedules in this one, because obviously the championship is always a goal, and so we want to set ourselves up with the best chance of winning if we can make it that far. We're only doing 5 wide receivers today, though, so if you want a complete list of all the wide receivers I trade for, along with other positions, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. So let's start things off as usual with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was Drew Brees is currently leading the league in expected completion percentage, but who ranks second? And the answer is Jimmy Garoppolo. And Nile Sachdeva, something like that, was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, among rookie wide receivers, who is currently leading the league in air yards per game? All right, let's do some wide receivers to trade for. And the top receiver this week, in my opinion, is Allen Robinson. Robinson currently ranks second in targets per game, 8th in air yards per game, but is only the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game, and is coming off back-to-back weeks outside the top 20 wide receivers, despite getting 25 targets over these last 2 weeks. Robinson's worst game on the season is 9 targets, and he's trailing only Jamison Crowder with 11 per game. 11 targets per game is a massive number. And the fact that, they aren't coming right next to the line of scrimmage is really important too. We looked at this last week when we talked about T. Higgins. We were excited about T. Higgins because he was getting looks, he was getting air yards, and a lot of his looks were coming downfield, and so he was bound to have a spiked week eventually. Of course, he did hit on the long play last week. That's not going to happen every play, but it's a very similar thing with Allen Robinson. He has had some really nice games. I would say it's mostly the touchdowns is kind of why he's not at the very top among fantasy wide receivers, but these two both have more downfield work than I think a lot of people realize. They're not going, his routes talking about, they're not going horizontally across the field. They're working downfield, and that's what we want in fantasy, because I would much rather have, a target 30 yards downfield than I would 5 yards downfield, because it increases your scoring chances, it increases your big play chances, all great for fantasy. And he's been getting a lot of these targets in really difficult matchups as well. He's faced the Colts, the Bucks, the Panthers, and these teams have given up the 15th, 7th, and 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So that's part of the reason he hasn't done incredible recently, is because these are really difficult matchups. So that's good. He's seeing great volume. He's seeing this volume in really difficult matchups. We love his route tree. There is one negative, though, and it's the next 2 weeks. He does face the Rams and the Saints, who have given up the 2nd and 8th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. Fortunately, after that, his schedule opens up a ton. After week 8, he closes the season with Titans, Vikings, Packers, Lions, Texans, Vikings again, and then Jaguars. Those teams have given up the 3rd, 2nd, 27th, 7th, 8th, 2nd, and 14th most fantasy points to wide receivers, meaning that all but 1 week will be against a below average pass defense, and 5 of his remaining 7 will be against some of the worst pass defenses in the league to wide receivers. Imagine Allen Robinson seeing 11 targets a game against these remaining teams. He might go nuclear to end the season, and coming off back-to-back scoreless weeks, outside the top 20 wide receivers, like I mentioned, right now is a really good time to get him. Because again, he's seeing this awesome volume even in tough matchups. So you can still start him in these next 2 weeks and then just watch him explode down the stretch. Next up, we've got Odell Beckham Jr. We had to let him cool off a bit after erupting against the Cowboys. But boy, has he done that. He's had 9 and 4 fantasy points over the last 2 weeks, finishing outside the top 40 wide receivers in both weeks. He now ranks 30th in targets per game, 13th in air yards per game, and is tied for 4th in targets inside the 10-yard line, yet only ranks 23rd in fantasy points per game. And that's including his 50-yard rushing touchdown, which obviously shouldn't be counting on as something that we can expect to repeat moving forward. We all knew that he would struggle, going up against the Steelers this past week. This was not a good matchup for the Browns. You don't want to play wide receivers going up against the Steelers. And we've talked about how the Colts have a really good pass defense too. And so, if you remember, he played them in week 5. So if we look at his upcoming schedule, it's really nice. So he plays these really difficult matchups after exploding against the Cowboys. And maybe his owners are like, yeah, I thought he was back, but you know what? There he is going back to what he was doing last season, earlier this season. I don't want him anymore. His upcoming matchups: Bengals, Raiders, Texans, Eagles, Jaguars, Titans, then unfortunately the Ravens. So he's got a stretch of really, really positive matchups. A brutal one against the Ravens. He can still do well in it, but I would say he probably won't. But then he faces off in the semifinals and the finals for the fantasy playoffs against the Giants and the Jets. Now, I try not to get sucked into narratives, but there is nothing that you can say that'll convince me that Odell Beckham Jr. doesn't care about that game in particular. Week 15 against the Giants. He's going to want to embarrass this Giants secondary, and we all know that he is a very emotional player. He can just take over a game, or he can get completely lost, but something tells me it's going to be the former in week 15. Now, you shouldn't just trade for him because of that matchup, but he is, like I went over earlier, he's being a little bit undervalued. Given his volume, he should be producing better in fantasy, and that's even counting that monster game against the Cowboys. He should be doing better, and I think he will be doing better going forward. And so if you're buying low regardless, and then you consider that if you can make it to the semifinals, he's probably going to explode, and then he's got a really nice matchup in the championship as well. I mean, that's a player that I want to get on my team, because if I make it to the playoffs, well, I want to win in the playoffs. I don't want to have just a mediocre team. And I really think he's going to explode semifinals and finals, so I would trade for him. Third wide receiver we'll go over today is Marquise Brown, and we've talked a lot about him in this video throughout the past few weeks, but it's kind of crazy that he just hasn't had a game where he's gone off yet. He keeps getting close, but he just can't seem to put it together in just a monster performance. He's now 31st in targets per game, 4th in air yards per game, but only 46th in fantasy points per game. Now, he has at least 6 targets in every single week, but just 1 touchdown on the season after scoring 7 as a rookie. One big factor is that the Ravens have taken a step back on offense this season. In 2019, they ranked first by a pretty wide margin in touchdowns per game, while also throwing for the most touchdowns. But this season, they rank 13th in total touchdowns and 19th in passing touchdowns. And so when you think about players underperforming, especially in the touchdown department, if they're on a very, very bad offense, you can maybe say, well, okay, we know the touchdown ceiling isn't high, and so there's going to be a lot of variance. Maybe they do have a season where they only score 2-3 touchdowns instead of having like a minimum of like 6 or 7. We're going to say that about a lot of players. But this is the Ravens. This is an offense that we are expecting to be one of the best in the league. We shouldn't be expecting them to throw like 3 touchdowns to wide receivers, right? I mean, obviously that's an exaggeration. They're going to throw more than that in the season. But the point is, they are definitely underperforming in the passing department so far. And I think that as a team, their actual average should not be first in the league, but it also shouldn't be 19th in the league. I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think they're roughly like the 7th to 12th best passing offense. That's what I would say. And especially considering that they're a very condensed passing offense. So we know that it's Mark Andrews and it's Marquise Brown and it's basically no one else. Everyone else is just getting little bits of volume here and there, whatever's left over. They're not throwing anything to running backs, barely anything to any other receivers. And so when they improve on offense, which I do think is going to happen this season, when that happens, it's going to be very beneficial to the only 2 players who are seeing volume. And given that Marquise Brown is currently first in the league in percent of team air yards, when they start to increase their passing volume, when they start to get better in the passing department, he's going to see a massive benefit. And so given that he's already on the current volume underperforming by like a lot, you have to think that once the offense overall gets better and he stops getting unlucky, he's going to have some blow up weeks. Another potential positive I just wanted to mention for like both sides, I guess, is one thing if you need to trade for a wide receiver that you have to play this week, you can't trade for Brown because he's on bye. You're not going to get any points this week. But that could be the case for someone else in your league. So there's definitely a lot of leagues out there where the Marquise Brown owner has him on bye, maybe has a couple other players on bye or injured, but they need to win now. And so they're going to place a lower value on Marquise because if you're trading them another wide receiver, running back that plays this week and they know they can play him because they need a win now, well, maybe they're going to be more willing to do a trade because he's on bye, because they already weren't going to be able to use him. Maybe they're already disappointed. And so it's very small. It's not a huge likelihood it's going to happen for all of you, but maybe it's the case. And I would make sure that you say that to the owner, give him a message and be like, hey, you got to win now. Look at your starting lineup. I'm going to give you someone who can play this week, and I'll take Marquise Brown off your hands. And so I think that would be a good strategy to go around. Next up, if you are in the market for a wide receiver one, Keenan Allen would be a guy I'd go after. He ranks 5th in targets per game, 22nd in air yards per game, but only 25th in fantasy points per game. Some people might be a little bit hesitant after he left week 5 early with a back injury, but it was only back spasms. He's coming off his bye. He should be 100% healthy. I don't think we need to worry about that at all. And I really think that people are underestimating the impact that Herbert makes to this offense. It's been night and day comparing him to what we saw under Tyrod. I know Tyrod only had like a week, but the point is Tyrod did not look good, and we knew immediately they needed a change at quarterback or the fantasy weapons on this offense were going to suffer. I really thought Tyrod was going to be solid to start. I thought he was going to start about like the first half of the season. Then they bring Herbert in, and maybe they get better, but I thought Tyrod was going to be okay. I was completely wrong. Tyrod was not good, and Herbert has saved this offense. And that's been really important for the skill players on the Chargers, and very important to Keenan Allen in particular. And let's also just look at just the total numbers. So sort by targets. Keenan Allen ranks 8th in total targets among all wide receivers this season, having already had his bye. Many teams have not had their bye yet. And then he left week 5 very early in the game. So he's effectively played 2 fewer games than most wide receivers. And to have the 8th most targets regardless of that is incredible. I mean, his 4 healthy games, he's had 8, 10, 19, and 11 targets. And that only single-digit game, the 8 targets, was with Tyrod Taylor. So 10, 19, and 11 targets in his healthy games with Herbert. He is going to finish the season top 5 in targets per game. It's very possible that it's basically him and Allen Robinson fighting for that top spot. But I really think Keenan Allen's going to finish with the most targets per game, and their scoring is only going to get better. Herbert's going to improve. Mike Williams hopefully can stay healthy. They're going to get Eckler back at some point, and so they're going to increase some points per game. That's going to increase his touchdown potential. And we've got a player that, is probably going to lead the league in targets, but currently ranks 25th in fantasy points per game. I think you need to trade for that person. So if you need a wide receiver one, we're going after Keenan Allen. And the final receiver is someone that did make the list last week, and that's Terry McLaurin again. McLaurin now ranks 8th in targets per game, 15th in air yards per game, but only 26th in fantasy points per game. Although he would be the wide receiver 9 overall if he had just 2 more touchdowns. Unfortunately, Washington ranks 30th at just 18 points per game though, so his scoring chances are going to be limited. McLaurin has done exceptional though when you consider the circumstances. He's had a rotation of quarterbacks, 3 different quarterbacks throwing him the football. He's seen shadow coverage from some very good quarterbacks. But you know what? I have hope for this offense under Rivera, but at the very least, let's just say you don't believe this offense will be any good, you don't trust Rivera. At the very least, we know that the pass attempts are going to be there. Even if this offense is bad overall, they're going to be top 10 in the league in pass attempts per game. And we know that McLaurin is going to dominate the air yards and the targets in this offense. So given that he's done really well so far and that he has been underperforming the current volume, anything else is a bonus. So even if they don't improve at all as an offense, he's still a good guy to go after because the current volume compared to the fantasy points makes him a value. But what if in the second half of the season they start to improve? Or what if he starts to get very lucky with touchdowns? He's getting very unlucky right now. What if that swings in his favor? well, then he's going to dominate, especially when you consider that he's facing the Cowboys, Giants, Lions, Bengals, Cowboys again over his next 5 matchups, and then he also gets to face the Seahawks in the fantasy semifinals. So he's got some great matchups on deck, and he's already one of the more talented wide receivers in the league. So his upside is incredible. All we need is for the offense overall to score a few more points per game, get into the end zone a few more times, and then his upside is crazy high. But even if that doesn't happen, for right now, given his volume compared to what he's been producing in fantasy, he's a value. So trade for him. So those are 5 wide receivers I'd be trading for this week. If you want a complete list of all wide receivers to target, as well as running backs and tight ends, then you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.